everyone. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. The first and the inaugural public lecture by Politicus. My name is Troy Sherman. I am the founder and managing editor of Politicus, a new undergraduate research journal here at Queen's that focuses on international relations and political studies. So we're very happy to have you all here. First of all, I'd like to thank the Arts and Science Undergraduate Society, which has helped fund us, as well as the Office of the Vice Principal Research. Both have been very generous benefactors to Politicus since we started in September. Before we begin, I'd just like to thank the Politicus team, who has been exceptional in helping to put this together, particularly Woody here, who's our workshops and lectures coordinator. And she helped put all this together and contacted all of our panelists, so it's very much appreciated. Patience is something that I do not have, but they have for me, so that's always good. And for those of you who are interested in any future public lectures or workshops by Politicus, or in publishing in Politicus, which will be happening in March, Michael Nossal here is our student liaison. If you have not written down your email address, your Queen's email address when you came in, please contact Michael. We should have passed out a couple of flyers to everybody. He'll be getting in contact with you about future events and deadlines. So, yes.
I'm good, yeah.
I'll be outside. So tonight we'll be discussing the dark side of IR, the untold story of IR as a discipline. And we have some pretty great panelists here tonight. And one of the major focuses of Politicus is to focus on undergraduate research, particularly in political and international affairs. So I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll be going into a 20 minutes worth of talks by each one of the panelists. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to present their opening thoughts on the issue. We'll then have 30 minutes worth of moderated discussion by Leanne Roderick, who is our moderator for this evening. Then there'll be 20 minutes worth of question and answers from you guys to the panelists. After which point we'll then have a reception, and there's lots of coffee and tidbits outside, and we'll be more than welcome to come up and talk to any of the panelists about what they've said or question them about what they've said. So I'll start introducing our distinguished panel for tonight. We have at first Lucia Guerrero. Lucia is a third-year political studies major and a development studies minor. Her current academic interests include international relations and international political economy. She is currently the caucus liaison for Queen's Law Parliament in the AMS and is a member of the editorial board for Politicus. Our second undergraduate student for this evening is Andrew Aulthouse, who is a political studies major with academic interests in international relations. He has previously worked with Dr. Christian Leuprecht in the School of Policy Studies, researching criminal networks. Outside the classroom, Andrew is a former Arts and Science student senator and is currently in his first year as the undergraduate student trustee on the University Board of Trustees. He is also a member of the Politicus editorial board. We're now moving into our professors who are joining us tonight, and we're very happy to have them. Professor Kim Richard Nossal is Professor of Political Studies and the Director of the School of Policy Studies, as well as the Director for the Center of International and Defense Policy here at Queen's University. Professor Nossal received his PhD from the University of Toronto in 1977 and joined Queen's in 2001 when he headed the Department of Political Studies until 2009. Having published many significant academic writings, Professor Nossal also served as editor of International Journal, which publishes quarterly issues concerning international relations. He has also served as president of Australian and New Zealand Studies Association of North America, as well as president of the Canadian Political Science Association. Our second professor tonight is Professor Wayne Cox. Professor Wayne Cox received his undergraduate degree and master's degree in political science and history from Carleton University and his PhD from Queen's University. Professor Cox is currently an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's and teaches a number of IR courses. Specializing in international political economy and Middle Eastern politics, Professor Cox has often written on a variety of topics in the field of IPE and IR. And finally, we have our moderator tonight. For many of you, she is a familiar face as a TA. Our moderator is Leanne Roderick, who is currently in her 4th year of her PhD here at Queen's under the supervision of Dr. Suzanne Soderberg. Her research is currently funded by a Shirk Doctoral Fellowship and focuses on the global governance of personal data. Having completed her undergrad at Queen's, her interest in IR was sparked by Professor Cox's Pulse 261 class in 2006, and has since served as a TA for numerous IR courses at Queen's, which led her to be a recipient of the AMS Christopher Napper Award for Excellence in Teaching Assistance in the 2012-2013 academic year. So let's give them a big round of applause for coming out today. Just some housekeeping items. The hashtag for tonight, thanks to Professor Rose, is hashtag #DarkSide. You can also tweet at Politicus. It is Politicus Journal without the A at the end. Also we have QTV here who will be recording tonight's event. So please be aware that you may be captured on video, and this will be going online on the Politicus website once it launches later in November. So you'll be able to refer to this panel later on throughout the year. So if you have any issues with that afterwards, please come see myself or Woody or Mohammed, who's in the back there, and we'll be able to figure something out if that's an issue for you guys. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Leanne. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Politicus for inviting me to moderate tonight. I have been in the hot seat at the hands of Kim and Wayne for almost a decade, so it's nice to have the tables turned for once. So we're starting with 5-minute sort of open introductions. We'll start with Kim, Lucia, Wayne, and Andrew, and I will give you a little flag when you have 30 seconds left. And whenever you're ready, take it.
All right, thank you. Let me begin by thanking Politicus, thanking Troy and all of the organizers. A big thanks to Kim for getting the video just right, and a thank you too to all of you who come out tonight to hear us. I'm particularly pleased to address this rather poorly phrased question. I'm particularly pleased to be back with my good friend Wayne Cox. For those of you who are waiting for it, no, I'm not going to quote Dan Aykroyd once again. You can only do that once, and otherwise I'm also a little worried that Cox will take me to the Human Rights Office if I call him that. The reason I say that it's poorly phrased, it is largely because to admit that there is a dark side of IR suggests that there's a light side. To say that we want to look at the dark side of international relations as a discipline, as a way of understanding the relations between individuals, the relations between political communities, is to suggest, in effect, that there is a part of the discipline that is more pleasant, that is nicer. For those of you who have been through the introductions to both my Pols 110 and back when it was an actual course 264, will know that I have a particular view of politics and a particular view of relations between political communities. And thus, for me, there is no light side. International relations is perpetually, relentlessly, and continually bleak and dark. There is nothing pleasant. It is true that you can take a look at some of the positive aspects of relations between political communities. All one has to do is to think about the impact of globalization over the last 25 to 30 years. Now, globalization as a process or as a set of processes tends to have a fairly negative connotation. But if you think about the brighter side of globalization, in particular the capacity of the processes of globalization to lift quite literally millions of hundreds of millions of people out of a particular kind of existence, one could say, well, surely there's something there. There's something positive too for example, the eradication of smallpox. There's something to the end of natural famines. We've got lots of artificial human-made famines, but the end of natural famines. My problem is that when we look at international relations as a discipline and think about what international relations tries to understand and convey, I see nothing particularly pleasant. For me, it's always about power and domination, hegemony, the way in which particular peoples at particular moments will seek to ensure that their interests prevail over the interests of others. And all you have to do is to spend some years looking at the human condition to reflect on the essential negativity. Most of you will know that one of the introductory slides that I put up is a street scene from Vienna in 1939, 38, 39, after the Nazis were welcomed into Austria by huge numbers of Viennese. You will know that some Viennese took particular delight in rounding up Viennese Jews and having them scrub the cobbled street stones of Vienna with their toothbrushes. And there's an iconic picture of Jews doing this, and they are surrounded not only by military officials, but also by citizens who are having a great laugh at this. This is an iconic picture, but it's very personal to me, in the sense that my great-grandmother was born a Jew in Vienna and was shipped off to the camps, deported, to use the euphemism. And so that for me, the issue of power and domination seems to me to be one of the key and pervasive issues and questions. And thus, I don't see any light side. For me and my career as someone who's tried to teach political science and international relations for the last 35, 40 years, it's always dark. Thank you very much.
For coming out. And I really wanted to thank also our panelists today. I'm definitely honored and humbled to be sitting with Professor Cox and Professor Nossal, and also to be sitting alongside my classmate, I guess, Andrew. I wanted to start off my bit, not addressing the dark side of IR yet, but addressing you guys. Andrew and I sit on this panel as students. We sit here just like you. We've probably taken the same courses as you. We probably have the same basic knowledge of IR as you, maybe just a little bit more Wikipedia knowledge that we might have done in the last 2 hours. But I just wanted to talk as if I was somebody from Politicus. This is a really great opportunity. You're all here because you're engaged. You're interested in not only issues of politics, but issues that you feel pertain to you and that you feel should be discussed in panels just like this. And so I really encourage you, you've come out tonight, and if you're ever interested, don't feel scared to sit here and sit alongside these big names and share your opinions and share what you think, because this is the point of it. The point is to hear what you guys have to think and to not be scared, to voice your opinions. Just because you're an undergrad, just because you've taken one IR course, doesn't mean that you don't know anything. I've only taken like 2 IR courses and I'm still sitting here. So I guess that was just like my little piece to encourage you guys to really get involved and to take tonight, see how you feel about it, and then see in the future if it's something that you want to be interested in. Okay, so in terms of the dark side of IR, what I'm going to address is the idea that it's international. My argument is that it's only really international in maybe subject matter and name, but in practice, not really. international relations is predominantly an American school. I find it's very Western-centric. But I also think it's remarkable, and I think it's something that we've all kind of heard about in our courses, and we all kind of know, but I think it's remarkable that it kind of slides under the radar. We acknowledge it, but we don't really talk about it, which is what tonight's all about, right? To really talk about it, but why do we need a panel to talk about it? Why isn't it discussed in class? Why isn't it not a course on something like this? And so what I kind of want to challenge is the idea that nobody really asks if the mainstream conception of IR is a reflection of values and attitudes itself. If it itself is picking certain historical facts and certain circumstances in this cultural framework that fits into a certain paradigm that is IR. And just a little something that I found interesting. It's not, of course, a be-all, end-all statistic, but something that I found that I should share with you guys is that Ollie Weaver did a study about what was the predominant, IR journals, and what was the relation of American authors and American texts being used within this. 80% of the authors in these journals were American. Now, that doesn't say anything about what they're writing about. I'm not saying that they're writing about American hegemony and American power, but it does kind of talk about where does the power of IR stand? Who's really talking about IR? Who's really engaging in this topic? It predominantly seems like the West. So you might ask yourself, what is the rest of the world saying about IR? If Canada and the US seem to talk so much about it, maybe what is China saying about it? Well, actually, the next country to sort of talk about these things would be Japan. But even it doesn't really talk much about theory. And China, who you might think, wow, they probably have their own IR tradition and they probably have a lot to say against the Americans, really focuses mostly on world security studies, not really on IR theory that much. And so I think that's kind of interesting about something that we learn so much here at Queen's, something that we see so much. The IR department is so strong, and we love all the profs. Everybody raves about all the profs in the IR department. But why is it such a big deal? Why aren't we talking about it's really only a Western thought? Why are we talking about that it's not really discussed anywhere else, and it's not really appraised anywhere else like it is here? So I guess my question for you guys is IR really that international? Or is it just an American ideal kind of being imposed on a study?
If I can be entirely self-serving, just to follow up on what you said, Ole Weber is in fact indeed a very important scholar in international relations, and I would encourage all of you to have a look at one of his books that he edited with Arlene Tickner called International Relations Scholarship Around the World, and in particular there is one exceptional chapter in that book, and that chapter is written by Kim Richard Nossal and Wayne Cox. Not in that order. Actually, what order is it in? Alphabetical, of course. Interestingly, when invited to this panel, I discovered that Dr. Nossal and I had considerable agreement on the dark side of IR. I do share his premise that a dark side would suggest that there is a light side of IR. And I also accept his kind of following conclusion that there really isn't a light side of IR so far. And in fact, listening to Dr. Nossal speak, I wanted to ask him a famous question. Is history over? And indeed, if you start with the generally accepted definition of what international relations is supposed to be, if you accept that international relations is supposed to be, and remember that scholars define things for their own particular interests, if it's supposed to be about understanding only issues of war and peace, and if you assume that the key actors in issues of war and peace throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century have been state actors, then you're necessarily going to see a very dark world indeed. And that's a consequence of what we define as international relations. On the one hand, people like Dr. Nossal can take this pessimistic worldview and can look at all of the wars throughout history, the wars that states have been involved in, or if you go to the pre-Westphalian period, wars that religious institutions in the West have been involved with, and other actors in world politics. And you can see world politics as a succession of conflicts. And you can write history as a history of war. Not forgetting the horrors of war is important. I'm very much a moralist in IR. And I think that, in the early part of the 20th century, where the fields became defined, responding to the mass violence of World War I. And I mean, you think about what happened in World War I. 40 million people lost their lives in a period of 4 years. We have no comparables in the latter part of the 20th century or the beginning of the 21st century. That was an absolutely grisly act of collective human violence. It was riveting. And indeed, it inspired the creation of the discipline. And you go through the 20th century and you say, well, if the war to end all wars didn't end all wars, and we had World War II, and 20 to 30 million people died during World War II, to say nothing about the human displacement and the misery and the Holocaust and the consequences of some of the draconian politics involved with World War II. You say to yourself, yeah, I could write a history of world politics that's all about war, but your starting assumptions are pessimistic. Your starting assumptions are that the world and world history has been nothing but a succession of competition and violence. And what that underplays is the fact that, as Dr. Nossal pointed out, there have been tremendous advancements in terms of human cooperation throughout the evolution of human history. That indeed, the creation of the Westphalian state was the end product of elevating human cooperation into an institution whereby we had essentially eradicated violence in domestic societies. And that I would say to Dr. Nossal that I don't think that history is over. If indeed the evolution of human cooperation has elevated cooperation to a high level, that indeed, if international relations has a light side, it's about doing precisely what you are doing. As students, engaging these key ideas and pushing the discipline forward. Yes, I agree with you that international relations is not as international as it should be, that it's mostly the history of the First World and its parochial interests, and it kind of shoved that down the throats of the rest of the world's experience, and that's problematic. I agree with Nossal that there has been terrible and ghastly conflict in human history, but human history is not over. Human history will continue. And to engage international relations and push for a light side of IR, to say, let's highlight cooperation, let's explore those avenues whereby we have seen instances where we have averted war, is to push the discipline forward and away from what it's set up to do originally. Maybe IR is not just about the study of Western interests and Western wars. Maybe it should be about a redistribution of global wealth. Maybe it should be about a preservation of common human rights. It can be about all kinds of things. And it's the new generations of scholars in IR that are going to push IR out of its dark phase. Thank you.
First off, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I would certainly encourage you to get involved with Politicus in the future. This past summer, I worked as a research student for Dr. Lou Prechton's School of Policy Studies, and I can attest that writing an academic article can be a very stressful but incredibly rewarding experience. So I'd recommend you get that chance as an undergrad through Politicus. So to me, I believe the dark side of international relations theory is that it has a very narrow scope. There's an incredible focus on the international state system, and while it does have merit, considering states are the way we've really organized the international community ever since the Peace of Westphalia. It also leads to other factors being ignored, because so much is left out there. And this explains a lot of the criticism IR theory receives for being gendered, for being ethnocentric, and for being elitist. So the IR focuses very much on states, and even when it doesn't explicitly focus on states, it focuses on the arenas that states participate in, whether that is concepts of superstructures, international institutions, and the like. But that leaves out a lot of other very important factors in the world. So whether that's an international civil society that's more active now than it's ever been before, whether that's the economy, something that IR has always struggled to adequately explain, whether it's multinational corporations that are acting in an increasingly stateless manner, or social issues that are certainly very important, but IR fails to adequately deal with concepts of gender in the international system and other social issues. It fails to often to deal with race or class. And also, the state system itself can be viewed as being challenged, whether it's through those multinational corporations or through the concept of new medievalism. The state retreats in various countries, and we see other actors take its place, whether that is warlordism or gangs. States don't have this monopoly. And also, the concept of states in IR comes from a time when there are far less states in the world than there are now. We've seen through decolonization and fall of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, an explosion of the number of states in the system. And there really are questions of, are all these states equal players in the system in the way many IR theories assume they would be? And can they all truly act in their own self-interest or in the interests of the institutions that they participate in? So I think a lot of the problems in IR can be reflected in the fact that it is so narrow in the scope, and the fact that the IR theory we learn in Canadian schools is really American IR theory, which is probably why realism is so prominent in theory here, if not in practice. In security studies, we often kind of theorize about the relationship between the United States and China, which is perceived to be the growing superpower. And as Lucia mentioned, there's all this knowledge of what American IR is. We don't talk about what Chinese IR is or really give that any focus at all. So ultimately, I would just say that IR is too narrow a discipline as it stands for an increasingly complicated world.
Questions. I have a brief introduction prior to the question, and then you'll each have 2 minutes to respond, and I will do my best to keep you all on time. And I shouldn't have to say this, but given the history between two of the panelists, let's try and keep it respectful and as best we can. Okay. Those who profess to be scholars of IR must meet the prerequisite of having an in-depth knowledge of the canon. The canon is a widely agreed upon collection of texts that are thought to constitute the core of the discipline. Some examples include Morgenthau's Principles of Realism, Nye and Cohen's Complex Interdependence, Hedley Bull's Anarchical Society, and Joseph Lapide's commentary on the Third Great Debate between positivism and post-positivism. There are also some rather controversial texts included in the canon, such as Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, a theory that people's cultural and religious identities will be the primary source of conflict in the post-Cold War era. Huntington's work has been variously critiqued as being ethnocentric, racist, and as omitting the dynamic interdependency and interaction of cultures. Another example of a controversial text in the canon is Francis Fukuyama's famous End of History argument, in which he purports that the Western liberal democracy marks the endpoint of humanity's socio-cultural evolution and the final form of human government. Fukuyama's argument has been leveled against as an example of Western intellectual hegemony, as well as being racist. One famous line reads, "For our purposes, it matters very little what strange thoughts occur to people in Albania or Burkina Faso." Additionally, not only are privileged men living and working in the West responsible for a vast majority of the texts that comprise IR's canon, but they are also the group that creates a consensus as to what is included and what is excluded. This leaves a lot of questions to be answered as to the gendered, elitist, and ethnocentric nature of IR. I would ask each of the panelists to discuss the content and criteria of IR's canon broadly. How does the field of IR contend with the canon, including the not-so-nice aspects of it, and what purpose does it serve?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
In 2 minutes. Look, it seems to me that the canon, as to paraphrase one scholar, is what you make of it. In a sense, I disagree wholeheartedly with the idea that this canon, it is indeed mostly Anglo-American as opposed to American. I disagree that it's been forced down anyone's throats, and I also disagree with the fact that, or with the assertion that somehow Canada is a sort of a hotbed of realism. In fact, if you take a look at how international relations is taught in the Canadian Academy, you'll see that for the most part, what you find is a healthy degree of skepticism of the realist canon. And indeed, if you look at who is teaching IR and ask, are they realists? The answer is quite clearly no. They may include some realist writings, but oftentimes it is for the purpose of trashing them rather than passing them on in a positive way. As to Huntington, look, I've written on Sam Huntington's work. A lot of it is just trash. In the following way, and that is that the idea that Professor Huntington articulates was essentially not at all put together well, and all you have to do is to take a look at how he characterizes civilizations in the contemporary era to recognize the degree to which this is an ill-thought-through idea. I wouldn't necessarily say it's racist, but it certainly is ill-thought-through. That having been said, Huntington identifies a really interesting phenomenon in global politics that other American IR theorists don't. And that is the whole idea of what he calls a kin country. And that is, he tries to grapple with how particular countries, particular polities, have a regard for one another that is not at all well captured by classical realist theory. And so you don't want to chuck out all of what Huntington writes, because some of the things that he focuses on actually do suggest that there's something to be made of it.
Thank you, Lucia.
Sorry, can you just repeat for me the last question?
Yeah. Discuss broadly the criteria of IR's canon. How does the field of IR contend with the canon, including the not-so-nice aspects of it, and what purpose do you think it serves?
I don't think the canon contends with the not-so-nice parts of it at all. I mean, if you look at what's within the canon, it's all sort of like core classical realism, or these core tenets of these broader IR theories that we've all learned within our courses. But I don't see those really changing much, and so I don't see them really dealing with whatever criticisms has come after they were published. They just remain within the canon. I mean, the idea that the end of history and the clash of civilizations are still categorized as within the canon is problematic. And so the fact that they're not even addressed at all just shows you how it doesn't really deal with the dark side of IR very much. I mean, what's the criteria to be within the canon? You have to be old, you have to be male, and you have to have, you have to have a framework that really doesn't apply over long periods of time, maybe just for one war or two. And then later that'll be adapted a little bit and adapted a little bit just to kind of make it seem like it's still alive. But I don't know, we talked a lot in Professor Cox's course about the canon and how it always seemed like we were trying to fit this frame across these different times and it wasn't really working. And that's kind of how I see the canon, as something that you're trying to not address what's within it, trying to place it across these different issues, and it never seems to quite fit right.
Thank you. Mr. Cox?
Leanne, it's an interesting question, and I'm going to take a kind of a different take on it. And since you did your graduate work, I've started doing 960, and I'm teaching it as the canon, and I'm actually forcing the graduate students to read selections from the canon, and there's a reason why I'm doing that. And for those of you who took a second-year course with me, I must say that one of the things that I did to you was a disservice, and that was I created cartoon caricatures of the canon, and I said, you know, this is a realist, and you know, this is an idealist, and I did it as this checklist of the primary assumptions that these people make. And the reason why I'm forcing the graduate students and my undergraduates now to actually read the canon is that I was sick and tired of people telling me what Morgenthau said, but they never actually read Morgenthau. And so, you know, you have to be exposed to the canon, but the different take that I take is not so much what's in the canon, but how you get into the canon, right? Thousands and thousands of things are published every year on international relations, but only certain things become some of the core fundamental ideas. So, you know, Morgenthau's a perfect example. He writes in 1948, Politics Among Nations, and he instantly becomes a core part of what is deemed to be essential reading in international relations. Yet Karl Polanyi writes in 1944 from a European perspective, and he's marginalized by international relations and then later rediscovered by it. What gets selected as the key part of the canon tells me everything about the field and not very much about the actual ideas that are in there. I mean, yes, indeed, the ideas that are in there are important and they must relate to international relations, but how international relations selects its canon, and it can be highly selective. You know, we pick one little book by E.H. Carr, The 20 Years Crisis, and we chuck it into the realist canon, and we forget about everything else that E.H. Carr wrote about, and we say this becomes a representation of E.H. Carr and the way history should be used in IR. So for students of IR, I think questions about the canon should be critical questions that are based upon A, actually having read it, not getting secondhand stories of the cartoon caricature version of it, and then asking questions. Why on earth does IR consider this book particularly important? And that reveals an awful lot about whether or not there is a dark or a light side to IR.
Yeah, so when you look at some of the names that are mentioned as being part of the canon, some interesting patterns emerge. As Lucia mentioned, they're all male. They're pretty much all American or British, and certainly all American or European, and they all are Ivy League educated, and more often than not Harvard, or if they're not from the Ivy League, they're from a comparable school in the United States, whether that's Stanford or the University of Chicago, or they're in the United Kingdom at LSE or Oxford. So there's certainly a prestige element, I'd say, to being admitted to the canon. It's and although there's a lot of kind of different opinions within that canon, and I think it does capture some of the different arguments in the field. So I don't think it's necessarily an exclusive echoing chamber, but it might be a bit of an exclusive debating group in a way. So it's so everyone in the canon is certainly along those lines, and I think if we were to progress IR as a discipline, you might cast a wider net as to who is admitted into the canon, considering these are all English language researchers, and that we don't have anyone who's, I guess, truly international, despite this being the discipline of international relations. So I think by expanding the canon in that sense, we'd certainly see some different perspectives emerge and possibly progress the discipline as a whole.
We can't do hot pursuit or anything.
I wish we had time. There have been moves to expand the field of international relations by feminist scholars. Feminists point out that a whole set of international relationships have been ignored by traditional IR, but are of vital importance to millions of people. For example, Cynthia Enlow highlights the experiences of the woman tourist, the Jamaican chambermaid, the American housewife, the British soldier, and the Belize prostitute to shed light on significant but neglected international relations. The major argument is that patriarchy is a crucial element of the present international system. Jan Tickner's famous article entitled "You Just Don't Understand: Troubled Engagements Between Feminists and IR Theorists" argue that feminist perspectives on international relations are quite different from those that inform the conventional discipline, leading to misunderstandings and marginalization of feminist perspectives. Though feminist and gendered approaches to the study of IR have proliferated, the impact on the mainstream discipline continues arguably to be negligible. And in a similar vein, the field of IR continues to be dominated by and pay homage to old white men, quote unquote. I will never forget a question posed to me by Professor Nossal during the oral defense of my PhD field exam in IR. After I wrote an essay defending and praising the contributions of gendered approaches to IR, Professor Nossal asked me, and I'm paraphrasing here, why we ought to consider these approaches at all given their relatively inconsequential impact on the field. Now, while I believe Professor Nossal was trying to be provocative in his line of questioning, he did reflect what tends to be a trend. While it's nice that a subfield of feminist and gendered approaches to IR exists, the fact is that these approaches remain sequestered from the conventional discipline. I'm curious about what the panelists think about the role of feminism and gendered approaches in the field of IR. Do they matter? Are they valuable? What purpose do they serve, if any? And why do you think these approaches in IR have faced so many obstacles?
Well, as an old white man, let me suggest that there are a couple of misconceptions or misassertions here. One is, by the accounts of some of the other members of the panel, IR isn't being taught by women across the world at all. And that just simply is not the case. The fact is that large numbers of women are teaching IR, and that then leads to the question of how IR gets taught in classes. And so that it seems to me that what one needs to ask is, what actually is happening in introductions to international relations in courses that are taught by female scholars who have a sympathy for a gendered approach to international relations. It bluntly put, it doesn't strike me as supportable to essentially say that folks like me have been ensuring the marginalization of these approaches when, in effect, folks like me are an increasing minority in the teaching of IR. And so the question that I ask, and you're right about the provocative nature, but the question that I do ask is, why is it when professors, male or female, walk into their classrooms across the world, not just simply in English language classrooms, but remember, virtually every one of the thousands of universities in the world today has something comparable to an introduction to international relations. Why is it that a kind of a gendered approach, not just simply some of the key issues that aren't talked about, I absolutely recognize, but why the introduction to international relations isn't entirely gendered? And in large measure, my response is implicit in the question I asked you, and that is, for all of the importance of recognizing gender as a key issue, can it provide us with an explanation for, an understanding of some of the broader issues. And I would say the answer to that is just simply no.
Okay.
That's a dark side.
I guess what I actually wanted to say kind of goes a little bit against what Professor Nossal just talked about.
Go for it.
I was reading the exact article or book that you just referenced with Tickner, and I found it interesting because it's interesting that you bring up visibility of female profs in IR, but I just wonder if visibility really means talking about gender. For example, Tickner writes in her book, she says that when she was studying, she found a lot of issues that weren't being talked about, and she kind of didn't like that as a woman, but then when she became a prof, she realized that while she was teaching IR, she was really teaching the exact same things that she hadn't liked when she was studying. And so I wonder if the visibility of women sort of across the world in the classroom really means that these issues are being talked about more? Does it really just mean that, which I think Andrew touched upon before, does it really just mean that these issues are being perpetuated within the classroom because they're not really talked about at all, regardless female or male? And so I guess what I sort of have to say about it is that although we can talk about different issues and how we see certain issues through a gendered lens, I really think it's interesting to reflect inwards and see IR through a gendered lens and how it's been constructed. I wonder if we went back and sort of looked at the canon, we looked at the creation of all the things we talked about in class, all of the tenets of realism and who wrote about those and talked about those, and we sort of looked gender there, and we sort of tried to see gender there, and we see that there's not a lot of female presence there. What does that tell us about the construction and the framework and the boundaries of international relations? What does that tell us about the discipline itself and what we learn as the foundation? Not just the issues, not just more women dying in war, but what does that tell us about the actual foundation of the discipline? Is sort of what I ask. But on the other side of that, I also ask, how far can you take gender? Is there a way to talk about gender while also sort of removing it from the situation, making something like a collectivity where we don't have to distinguish between two different genders? Is there a way to just talk about everything really just on an equal field?
There's kind of two things at work here. I mean, there's female representation in the professional discipline. And Kim's right. I mean, there a lot of progress has been made, and there are a lot more women in the discipline than there were before. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that they bring with them a gendered understanding of international relations. I mean, if the field was to be dominated 99% by women and they were all Margaret Thatcher realist types, I wouldn't want anything to do with the discipline, to be quite frank with you. But that's my own particular perspective. If the field was dominated 100% by men and they were all Craig Murphy feminists, I'd be happy with that. A gendered perspective, I think, is enriching to the discipline for a whole variety of reasons. I think gendered perspectives force us to re-articulate some of the key issues in world politics in very different ways, and I think I would disagree with you on the canon. Cynthia Enlow's Bananas, Beaches, and Bases is a key part of the canon, and the canon is not devoid of women scholars or of feminist representations in the discipline. I think that they are. And I think they're there, and they are increasingly there because they force us to reanalyze things like war in very different ways. We see war differently when we look through gendered lenses, and that's important. So there's two things going on. I mean, there is the question of work equity in universities, and one of the things that I find fascinating and perplexing is why aren't more women attracted into the study of international relations? Is it because of the traditional subject matter? You know, do young women, you know, at the age of 17, 18, 19 at university say, I'm not interested in that course, because it's all macho jock guys talking about, you know, bombs and guns and rockets and power determining outcome, and I could give a shit about that. If that's the case, then I think the subject matter of the discipline is a problem, because I think the discipline could be about a whole variety of other things. So there's the representation of women within the field, but there's also gendered perspectives inside the field. And I think that IR has done itself partly a service by kind of carving out a differentiation between IR proper and IPE. Because I think within IPE there is room for a critical discourse in which feminism has become respected and has been actually very significant in enriching the types of creative approaches that you see in IPE, and that spills back into IR. I mean, Cynthia Endlow's subject matter is issues of war and peace, so she's taking the gendered perspectives and going right to the core of the discipline and saying, hey, put these lenses on, you see war in a very different way. Yes, there's a long way to go, but indeed, you know, IR, again, it has this core definition of what it is that is inherently conservative. It's status quo. It is not interested in change. And if these perspectives are out there kind of nudging people along, I think all the more power to them.
And that's a light side.
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily light. I mean, there's a dark side to the gendered repression in the discipline too. So, I mean, the lightness comes out of darkness. Don't tweet that.
There's something you can capture in 140 paragraphs.
There you go.
Andrew.
So I think it's interesting to talk about whether or not these feminist and gendered theories are of consequence, because I believe to some extent traditionally they haven't been allowed to be of consequence, that IR traditionally has been male dominated and that we've really focused on the more conventional theories, I suppose. And I'd echo something that Professor Cox said in that being a male professor or a female professor shouldn't have anything to do with taking a gendered perspective to IR, because I think you can be a male feminist and you can be the case of the Margaret Thatchers of the world who take a much more realist perspective. So I think that is a bit of a stigma in the discipline, that we assume that if you're a female IR scholar that you will take a gendered perspective. And so I think that holds back a lot of people in that sense. And traditionally that a lot of the scholars in the canon, although this is changing, have been male, and that a lot of the figures in international relations and practice, a lot of world leaders, a lot of civil servants within the United Nations and other international bodies, a lot of foreign secretaries and foreign ministers, a lot of them have been male. So I think there is that stigma that is slowly being overcome. And actually in preparation of this talk, I looked at the syllabi for the Intro to IR courses at U of T, McGill, and Harvard, and it was interesting to note that none of them included any section on gender in IR. So I think that's an interesting thing within how IR is being taught, because it does lend itself to a lot of interesting perspectives. You know, if you're taking a realist perspective and saying that IR is a study of war and peace, gender lends itself a lot to that study and a lot of new dimensions that otherwise you're not going to talk about. Because then you can look at rising civilian casualties throughout the 20th century in war, a lot of whom are female, or you can look at the use of rape as a weapon. So I think there's a lot that can come out of that, and it only can progress the discipline, I feel.
You did pick the three worst universities.
Why those universities? Of the thousands and thousands and thousands of universities, the fact that you would focus on those three says a lot more about your perspective than about the discipline as a whole.
Well, I also looked at a few others, but they all included
No offense to Dr. Nossal's PhD, but never study IR at U of T as far as I'm concerned.
No offense taken, sir.
The subject matter and debates that emerge in the field of IR are often aimed at the development of policy-applicable knowledge. Stanley Hoffman famously noted the revolving door between academics and politics that came about in the 1960s, when IR scholars were not only in the corridors of power, but also, as he put it, in the kitchens of power. One famous example is Henry Kissinger, a Harvard professor who went on to serve as national security advisor and a key player in the Cold War. It's also been confirmed that Kissinger met regularly with President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney in the early 2000s to offer advice on the Iraq War. Another example of policy informing IR research is the democratic case theory, the liberal IR argument that democracies do not wage war with each other, which has been used to justify the initiation of war in recent years. I pose the following questions to the panelists. Do you think that IR, especially the American school, is beleaguered by a conflict of interest when it comes to producing a certain type of research that can be used to not only inform, but in some cases justify government actions? What might be some dangers of producing policy-relevant research in terms of what is deemed appropriate subject matter and method? If not policy relevance, what is the place and purpose of the academic discipline of IR?
Well, that's a very, very Americocentric perspective on the relationship between the discipline and practice. It's also a very elitist perspective in the sense that if you look at the number of human beings who are professing IR in the 4,500 universities in the United States, precisely how many end up in the corridors, much less the kitchens, of power in Washington? I mean, we're talking about a tiny, tiny number of people who rotate in and out of the American state depending on who's in power. And thus, to somehow suggest that American IR in particular, or IR in general, is somehow put in this explicit way, the service of the state, I just don't think reflects reality. Certainly it doesn't reflect reality in Canada. In Canada, the state basically has nothing to do with those who profess IR, and it doesn't matter whether you're conservative or liberal. The Canadian state basically does not bring individuals in. And thus, if you look at the overall output of scholars of international relations, I guess I just don't see the evidence that all of our scholarship is either the purpose of it is to whisper in the prince's ear, number one, or that the prince could give a damn about what any of us are saying. I just don't see any evidence of that at all. Mr. Kissinger, Mr. Nye, Ms. Rice, notwithstanding.
I think I'm going to focus a little bit more on the relation almost top-down, so from policy and how does that affect academic research. And I'm going to bring up 9/11. So 9/11 happens, and what kind of academic research comes out in the States after? You have George Bush saying you were either with us or you were with the terrorists, and whatever policy implication that comes with that. So how much IR research, and I didn't read every single journal article that came out between 2001 and 2005, really is challenging that statement? Probably not that many. And I think, Professor Cox, you can correct me here, but in 261, and whoever was in that class with me, you told us a story about how you went on a panel, and you talked, you didn't talk at first, and then you talked about Afghanistan, and your take on the idea of framing a state actor, and your views on Osama bin Laden, and you said that between the walk home, which was about 5 minutes.
That was a TV interview, yeah.
Yeah, you had gotten hundreds of hate mail, just because you hadn't really sided with what had been this American idea of you're either with us or against us. Would that be?
Well, I was more provocative than that. I suggested that if the American state was interested in using its military firepower to eradicate Al-Qaeda, that they should start bombing Paris, and London, and parts of New York City, because their tentacles were there as well.
So, but that's what I'm saying. How much of the academic research that was coming out was really being that provocative, and we're seeing that a lot of that now. But really, right after, with the policy implications with what was coming out of government, with the statements that were coming out right after 9/11 in the States, how many people were really challenging that idea, what was happening, without having a huge backlash. And so I think that that's really interesting, and that's sort of the relationship I see between policy implication and then kind of how that funnels certain academic research and what's accepted and what's frowned upon.
I'm afraid I'm going to take issue with Kim here.
Finally.
You know, on the one hand, I think in sum total you're right. There's not the revolving door that many people portray. But certainly in American IR, there is a close relationship. And the relationship may not necessarily be those who physically wind up in the State Department and also in the corridors of the Ivy League universities. But there's a clear relationship between the research interests of international relations in the United States and the American state and its foreign policy. And you know, well, I remember Edward Said, actually, the one and only time he ever went on CNN, and it was after 9/11. Said died in 2003, so it must have been in 2001 or 2002. And he goes on CNN, and why they picked Edward Said, I have absolutely no idea, because this was a time of heightened kind of sensitivity and concern over terrorism. And he absolutely trashed CNN, not so much with its editorial line, but with the parade of obsequious, quasi-academic, quasi-intellectual morons on CNN apologizing for the American state and essentially coaching the post-9/11 politics in the politics of hate. And he said that these, what he called pseudo-intellectuals, but these are American IR scholars working at universities, he said that they deserved a fate worse than death because they were culpable in propagating a war of ignorance and a war of hate. And I never saw him again on CNN. I mean, you know, he lasted for a couple of minutes before Wolf Blitzer just tossed him out of there. But you know, he had a point that there is this kind of symbiotic relationship. Now, whether or not it has to do with the sort of funding structures of think tanks in the United States, which might kind of partly explain it, yeah, that might have something to do with it. Whether or not it has to do with the sort of obsequious nature of egoistic academics, and believe me, there's a ton of them out there, people that think that their ideas matter and that they want to basically kiss ass with the state, and they feel compelled to sort of give policy advice and say the sorts of things that the state wants to hear. There's a lot of that out there. There's more of it in American IR than there is elsewhere. I mean, I do agree with Kim that, you know, that the state doesn't try and interfere with our research projects. You know, if you apply for and get a shirk, it doesn't come with any kind of, you know, political strings attached to it. But the overall enterprise of American IR scholarship, I think, is very undeniably connected to the interests of the American state. And the American case is probably exceptional. There's a little bit of that in former great powers like Great Britain and elsewhere in Europe, and a little bit of it in Canada too, but not very much of it. But the American state is exceptional in that way. And I think that if you look at the main theories of IR, and the things that researchers deem to be important things worthy of investigating, the close working relationship is key. Now, I don't dismiss that literature or that research as necessarily being bad research, but I think you have to ask political questions. There's just far too much of it out there to deny that it is not connected to the interests of the American state.
So I do think there's a lot of reasons why there would be a close relationship between IR theory and then policy and practice. I mean, sort of it lends legitimacy to both sides, because if you're a theorist and there's policy being made based upon your academic theories, legitimizes you because sort of gives you street cred to your theories. This is how it applies in the real world. And if you're making policy and you're saying you're basing it on an academic source, that this is high-minded, that this has been real research, this isn't just a policy wonk coming through, I think that does explain that close relationship. But I don't think I would delve into the conspiracy theory territory of kind of it dragging one down over the other. And I do feel that within IR as a discipline, there's a normative value to it besides just the policy. I mean, I'm someone who think would be very interested in working in the policy side of IR, the IR of the real world, I guess, as opposed to in academia. But I do think there is quite a normative value to IR at its core, which is understanding human behavior and how humans interact on the macro level through states and other institutions. So I think if you even were to remove the policy, there's still a lot of value to be found in IR theory and the study of the discipline.
It could be argued that the field of IR is relatively static in terms of progression. More often than not, we see reiterations of the same core theories. For example, in the field we have classical realism, defensive realism, offensive realism, the English school of realism, neoclassical realism, etc. Some have commented that since the failure of the discipline to predict the end of the Cold War, the field of IR has become stagnant, meaning that nothing all that innovative or unprecedented has surfaced in the past several decades. Do you agree with this assessment of the field? If not, what are some examples of new trends within IR as a discourse? And do you believe that IR still offers important contributions to how we understand the world? How relevant is IR today?
Yes to all. No, there's no doubt that there's a certain degree of stagnation. Certainly, the constant reinvention of different forms of realism is an indicator of that stagnation. On the other hand, take a look at the last 20 years worth of academic work on critical theory, on constructivism, and you get a rather different, I think, a different picture. Not to mention, and something that doesn't get mentioned by Canadian students of IR because it's not taught, and that is the sort of the ultra-behavioral approach. All you have to do is to pick up a recent issue of International Studies Quarterly to get some sense of what passes for international relations scholarship in some places in the United States. What's really interesting is that in Canada, with the lone exception of those Canadian universities just mentioned, this kind of IR just simply isn't even taught. It's not taught in graduate programs, it's not taught in undergraduate programs. It's an entire field or subfield in IR that remains utterly untaught in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Britain. In short, the only place it is taught is in the United States and in those 3 political science departments in Canada that are hugely Americanized: UBC, U of T, and McGill. And so that from that point of view, I'm pleased because that this particular form of IR isn't being taught, but it's not that kind of stagnation. Is IR continuing to be relevant? Look, when you look at how IR in China is being taught, you can get some sense, and because because we speak the universal language, we tend to be incredibly limited in what we read. But if you take a look at the professing of IR in China, what one sees is, in a sense, not only a reflection of what people would call American IR, constructivism, structural realism, etc., but you also get the adaptation of Americanized IR in a Chinese context. And so that if you take a look at how vibrant IR is in China, and then you ask yourself, what kind of tradition would IR students, IR scholars fall into if they were in North America? You find out, oh, they're realists of some sort or other, which strongly suggests that in fact realism continues to be, despite its constant reinvention, realism continues to be something that people conceive of as relevant ways of understanding human behavior within the context of political organizations, politics.
Thank you.
I mean, I touched upon it probably in the first or second question, but I really believe that IR is quite stagnant. I think it's a set of core values, and what really changes is sort of what's around it. I mean, when you look at realism, sort of its evolution comes when it can't explain what's happening anymore. It sort of needs to reinvent itself while maintaining the core values, but adding some things on that helps explain what it couldn't before. And so I guess to keep my answer short and sweet, I sort of think that the structure of the IR address is really just, it's the same, it just depends on how much frill you want to put on it. That's what I think about it.
This is what absolute nerds Nossal and I are. Okay, we're driving over here. We're discussing this on our way over. And Kim was saying to me, "Oh, you're doing 960 this term. What's new in IR? What's going on in IR?" You know, and I mean the answer is kind of, well, same old, same old. You know, the reinventions. We've now got like complex pseudo post-nasal neorealism, and you know, we just throw a couple of acronyms on. And in fact, I mean, I've been in this business studying IR for more than 20 years, and I'll be quite honest with you. I'm kind of bored, and I'm bored because I'm sick and tired of reading the same argument with a different neo in front of it. So when I get really, you know, enticed, hey, I want to read something really new, I crack open a journal of critical human geography. And there's all kinds of fun stuff in there. I'm reading, like, you know, John Agnew, Ideational Space, and David Harvey. I'll crack open a copy of International Political Sociology. When I say I'm bored, I haven't disengaged. I've stepped outside of the field. And I'm not alone. There's lots of scholars in IR that, you know, once you know the canon, once you know all the arguments and the re-arguments, and then you say to yourself, well, where can I find new information? And for me, early in the career, it was to step into IPE and to learn about Gramscianism and Neo-Gramscianism and Foucauldianism and those sorts of things, and the various feminisms. Now I'm stepping outside of the discipline. There are new ideas. And those new ideas, they find their way back into the discipline. They really do. I mean, sometimes it takes a little while, but they do find their way back into the discipline. So you know, yes, IR is kind of dead, or maybe a little bit reinventing of the wheel, but things are finding their way in. There was something else I was going to say, but I'm going to go too long, so I'll stop.
So I think it's been mentioned already that IR is conservative by nature. It very much upholds the status quo. So I think that lends itself to a degree of stagnation. We often see theories being reiterated to suit different real-world examples and make slight adjustments, but without any real new ground being broken. But that's not to say there have not been new theories. We've seen an increase in constructivism and critical theories in recent years. But as Professor Cox mentioned, other disciplines are certainly more progressive, and while IR remains relevant, in order to ensure that it will continue to be a relevant discipline, we'll certainly need to stay progressive, or to become progressive, and to draw upon more progressive disciplines to really provide an IR for the 21st century and beyond.
All right, last round. Given all that's been discussed this evening and the title of the event, I'd like to ask each of the panelists again, point blank, if they believe that IR does indeed have a dark side. Do you think yes? How does the dark side, including elitism, sexism, ethnocentrism, policy relevance, and stagnation in the field, affect how we teach and learn the discipline? As a student of IR, can you envision any alternatives as to how the discipline is taught? How can we, as teachers, adjust our approaches to teaching and learning to ensure that we overcome this dark side? If your answer is no, can you provide any alternative critiques as to how the discipline has been shaped and how best we can teach it? Or, alternately, do we just keep with tradition and carry on?
Well, this is a really easy question for me to answer, given that I'm an old, white male who's also fairly conservative, deeply inertial at the end of my career. There's no doubt that for me, the questions remain always the same. And in that sense, there you might say, yeah, there's a certain stagnation. There's a certain unchangingness. Now, I'm not, as many of you know, not a universalist when it comes to these things. But I still, unlike Professor Cox, I still am fascinated because after studying this since 1967, when I was still a high school student in Hong Kong and watching the unfolding of the Vietnam War, there are elements that I still don't understand, and it's that effort to understand the human condition in all of its broad array that I think makes international relations not the academicized, theorized part of the discipline, but international politics as an intellectual pursuit. That remains always very relevant to me, and in that sense, I think that the discipline remains relevant. Lose the theories and lose the caricatures, and concentrate on the core, and I think you will continue to be engaged until you're done.
I actually, speaking just from my experience and the way it's been taught to me here at Queen's, I'm sure many of you took 264 with Professor Nossal, and then the next semester you took 261 with Professor Cox. And I actually kind of had an interesting experience with that, because when I was sitting in class with Professor Nossal, you hear like rising powers are going to fight the declining powers, and everything made so much sense to me, and I was like, yes, this all makes sense. And then the next semester I stepped into Cox's class, and it's like realism is like not okay, like 6 core tenets do not make sense. And I was just like, I just ate everything up that Nossal just fed me, like, you know what I mean?
Fire Cox.
It's a good thing we did it that way, because you would have been terribly moronic and depressed at the end of that term. And at least at the end of my term, you would have been optimistic and embraced life.
And so I found that kind of interesting, and I actually did what Andrew did as well, and I looked through the syllabi like a total nerd of all these different universities, and I really enjoyed the way IR was taught to me. I didn't enjoy that I was learning realism without knowing it was realism, but at the same time, that's part of it, right? That's part of the learning, and I found that was really interesting, because then it made me really reflect on everything that I had already learned. What I also found really interesting is that we use the same textbook as an introduction to IR as Harvard, and so I was kind of like, I got a Harvard education for $60,000 less. No, but really, overall, having looked at the way it's taught elsewhere, and having looked at the way it's taught here, and the way that the professors teach it, I find it is relevant. And I agree with Professor Nossal that if you take away the theory, maybe you take away some of the problems, it still seems to be something that we really talk about, and that everybody's really engaged. I mean, you're all here for an IR discussion on the dark side of it, right? So it's still relevant. It's still something we study. I would probably say it's one of the strongest departments at Queen's. So it's obviously something that we all hold near and dear to our hearts as political science nerds. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that.
I think part of the reason why I personally have gotten bored is that the conventional understanding of international relations and this conventional notion that we've got human nature figured out. And in a sense, I was kind of like chipping away at Kim's argument early on, because it's almost as like if history was over. We now have it figured out that states fight with one another. They always have and they always will. And we can develop some kind of a conceptual or theoretical framework, and it's going to help us organize our understanding of world politics, and we'll go out after taking Pulse 264 and we'll view the world like that, and it might be maybe a little bit depressing and it's a little bit nasty. And all of that, I would argue, is why I get bored, because I think that IR runs the risk of taking its eye off of the ball. And I'm far more optimistic. I see a world that's not static, The world of today is not the same as the world of the Peloponnesian Wars. It's really different and it's uncomparable. It's a world that's in transition. And when I think of the last 20 years of world politics and I say, okay, you know, I know my realism, I know my Wendtian social constructivism, and these are interesting ideas. What ideas out there in world politics have motivated people to act, have motivated people to become involved in world politics? And I would say that one of the most pervasive and newest and fascinating areas is this notion of challenging Westernism, challenging modernity, challenging American hegemony, sometimes been articulated by what people call Islamic radicalism within the Muslim world, but it might be cloaked in the language of clerics, and it might be cloaked in the rhetoric of religious politics. But there seems to be a sort of widespread social movement of people who are dissatisfied with globalization and modernization and the distribution of wealth. There are people who are dissatisfied with the perpetual projection of Western power and Western interests in the Middle East. And these things are coalescing around ideas, and these ideas are the challenging of the existing order, and IR has no tools to see that. You can restudy realism until the cows come home. It's not going to help you see that. And world politics is changing. And IR should be developing ideas to capture, dissent of the West, or to capture why people are being mobilized, to capture what's going on that seems to persuade some people that they're not getting their fair share as wealth is being created in the world. And unless or until the new generation of scholars of IR come up with intellectual tools that can capture that, then by reinventing the wheel, we run the risk of missing what's really going on in world politics. And so to me, the reason why I step outside of the discipline to learn new things is that I'm looking for those answers. I don't want to have a depressing conservative worldview where I can predict based upon some depressing notion that humans just always inevitably conflict with one another. I'm sorry, Kim, but I just can't live like that myself.
Yeah, so I do think that IR is a fairly narrow way of framing the world as it currently stands. That being said, I do appreciate the teaching of it that I received, because no matter what your thoughts are on realism or liberalism, there's a lot of value in learning them and understanding them to understand how we got here as a discipline and where we are going in the future. So I think that's very important, but what I feel where the real challenge is not in teaching it in that way and looking at the old theories. It's how do we create new ones and how do we continue to progress as a discipline? Because, as mentioned, the world is changing an incredible amount. It's not a stagnant world. We see new factors emerge. But the theories in IR largely remain the same. So it's how do we address that and how do we move forward? Because I do feel that international relations is an incredibly relevant topic. I mean, we all live in this international community that it paints, and how we continue to view it and how we continue to be participants in it will be very much shaped by IR theory as it progresses. So I think if we can catch up with the world and keep up with it, I think IR theory can remain very relevant.
All right, hand of applause for our panel. Q&A? 10 minutes of Q&A? 10 minutes? Okay. Who wants to go first? You brave souls.
See, they all agree.
Thank you.
Professor Cox, would you apply your view on the realism and looking back in that, like, I don't know if I can ask this because it's not really international relations, but like to the American Constitution as well, and how they shouldn't keep looking at the same and like step out and take a different look at it?
No, I'm not sure I understand your question. Are you saying?
It's like the American Constitution, like in Canada, I assume I haven't studied Canada at all, but they seem like older stuff that haven't really been revamped. In the American Constitution, I feel similar way.
Are you saying that the American Constitution should evolve as America changes?
Yeah.
I suppose one could make that argument. I mean, you know, a constitution is a very different thing from a part of the canon. A canon is a reflection of world politics, and it should, or at least it usually winds up being a sort of organizational device that helps you think about world politics. A constitution is a set of rules and regulations that a society, you know, kind of agrees upon. When it comes to fundamental state institutions like constitutions, they tend to be inherently conservative and not change because they're the fundamentals that bind that society together. You know, would I like certain parts of the American Constitution to be changed? Yeah, but I have no stake in America. The right to bear arms kind of profoundly disturbs me, or at least the way it's being interpreted in modern America. You know, I'd love that part to be unwritten from the American Constitution, but I don't live in a fantasy world. It's not going to happen. But you know, the notion of an evolutionary constitution I don't think is comparable to the idea of canons and IR. You know, if you disagree with a certain worldview, whether it's Samuel Huntington or Morgenthau, you engage those ideas and you come up with an alternative view. You don't just quite simply ignore it and walk away. And that's what's important about creating a journal, you know, like Politicus. Because the whole idea of the journal is that if students think there's a dark side of IR and they don't like some of the ideas that are out there, don't just ignore it and walk away. Write about it. Engage those ideas. And that's what moves a field forward. And that's why, you know, at the end I was, you know, trying to woo people into thinking that IR can change, because the IR of the future is your IR. I'm not as old as Kim Nossal, but I'm getting old. You know, and someday it's not going to be my IR either. It's going to be yours, and it's going to be yours to change. And the only way you can change it is by understanding the core ideas that are out there to start off with, and if you don't like them, challenge them.
In the back.
Kind of building on what you just said at the end there, you guys mentioned that there could be a new overarching theory of IR. So do you think, given that realism and liberalism have been kind of disproven to be a fully overarching theory of everything to do with IR, and the emergence of critical theories has become more prevalent, do you think that there could be a new overarching theory of IR, or is the future of IR just more critical theories that analyze more specific aspects of international relations?
I don't know who are you directing the question to?
Anyone who wants to answer that again.
You're gonna get two very different answers.
I mean, I'll just chime in to say that I think of the period of IR when it was dominated by realism, if you believe that narrative, you know, from let's say 1948 until the 1970s, I don't think is as healthy as a discipline that has a variety of different perspectives. I think intellectual pluralism is healthy for any discipline, but that's my own personal take on it. Other people would think that...
You don't think that international relations as a discipline today is one of the most pluralistic
I do
disciplines?
today. I do. I say by contrast.
Especially the way that it's been taught in the North American Academy,
Yeah.
with this relentless focus on isms,
Yeah.
that, as you nicely admit, tend to get caricatured up the wazoo. I mean, one of the reasons why in 264, as I indicate explicitly, I stay away from this is because I think there's a really strong pedagogical case to be made that we do students a huge disservice by introducing them to this range of isms that are supposed to make the world understandable. And trying to capture those various different perspectives, very pluralistic perspectives, and then add an ism at the end, actually, I think over the long term is not at all useful.
Although, why pass dependency?
Well,
Does that help get around that problem?
in part because as I did try and explain to the class, I was given a course called World Politics in Historical Perspective. And the best that I could do was to look at it from from the notion of path dependence. I don't think path dependence is the be-all and end-all, but it certainly provides a way of conceptualizing and understanding something in the present from the perspective of the past.
We'll go to the back.
This is just a general question. Given the stagnation of international relations, would you say that applied international relations right now is just giving legitimacy to American foreign policy?
Good question.
Sorry, applied international relations, did you say?
Just internet. Just.
No. I was wondering if you were talking about a particular kind of IR. I guess that all of you have had exposure to IR as a discipline, and is it patriarchal? Yes. Is it conservative? Yes. Is it inertial? Yes. Is it stagnant? Actually, I wouldn't buy into that. But to the extent that this in some way legitimizes American foreign policy, I don't see the connection there at all. Because if you take a look around at the various governing structures, the various states in the international system, and indeed the various non-state actors of all sorts and varieties, it's not clear to me that their behavior can be legitimized in a particular way. Can it be understood by using some of our understandings of international relations that have been classically taught? In my view, yes.
I'm going to ask this question to Lucia. Being a student of IPE and global development, you, like many of us, have been exposed to a lot of critical studies and critical theories. But often critical studies are critiqued for purely being critical and not so much offering solutions to problems in IR. What direction do you think critical studies need to take in order to be more effective or start being recognized as being able to come up with solutions, not just being a school for critiques of what already exists?
Well, I think the answer is almost in the question that you're posing, right? It would be, if we're talking about future, it would be perhaps not focusing so much about being a critique, because when you start seeing critique, I mean, you can always get a critique of a critique of a critique, and there's holes here, and then you can see maybe the theory that it's critiquing stands better in some points than the other does. So I think perhaps it might be just a focus of building these critical theories as not critical theories anymore, building them as theories that actually stand alongside, that aren't necessarily, I don't know, it's just, I think critical, it has to be critical of something. So immediately you acknowledge almost the hierarchy or the longer history or the hegemony of the other theory. Does that make sense? Right? So I guess to answer the question, it would really just mean building the theory more on its own rather than leaning on something else in order to give it legitimacy. If that answers it.
But has that happened in the case of critical theory in particular in global development studies, which was, I think, implicit in the question, and I think implicit in your answer is, geez, it hasn't happened.
No.
Why not?
Could that be the way that IR might see it and the dominance of IR, and then how it might not allow it to?
But for those of you in global development studies here, I mean, how many of you have actually looked at classical IR theory? IR theory from the perspective of the canon. Doesn't happen. I mean, what we have at Queen's is the true silos, intellectual silos, where you guys off in devs go your own way and folks in Pols go their way. There isn't that kind of building that you're talking about.
But I think IPE, or perhaps the way that 262 was taught to me, might actually not start bridging the two, but definitely touches upon it, doesn't make them so mutually exclusive anymore.
for one more question. Do you have a question or?
Unless somebody else has one.
We'll go over here. Last question.
I'm just wondering if any of you guys maybe think that the problem with the dark side of IR is more of a common problem in all academic fields, and maybe it's not actually just a problem of IR. Because I just, as you say that if there's a dark side, there has to be a light side, that also kind of implies that IR is different from other faculties or fields in that it does have a dark side. I feel that problems of ethnocentrism and like sexism are kind of apparently.
I mean, it depends on how, what I view as the dark side and what you view as the dark side may be completely different things. Part of the discussion here seems to have moved in the direction of if IR is culpable and a part of providing policy advice for American hegemony, then that's dark, right? Well, I have news for you. Study Canadian politics. And there will be an element of Canadian politics that involves doing research that's directly tied to the interests of the Canadian state, or there are scholars in Canadian politics who are very interested in having their ideas being taken seriously by the Canadian state, or in comparative politics or whatever. I mean, I think one of the most evil academic ideas that's out there right now is not realism in IR. It's those scholars who uncritically make liberal arguments about the virtues of democracy and democratization without thinking seriously about the consequence of who's manipulating those ideas and what for what political purposes. And I actually think that liberalism is the new evil of IR. And I see some of these liberal scholars, and my definition of a liberal has always been the same. A liberal is someone who's smart enough to see exploitation but too weak-kneed to do anything about it. Right, and so I kind of view these people as actually being even more dangerous than realists. With realists, I can see their politics like a freight train coming down an alley. Whereas with these kind of seductive liberals who cozy up to the state, in IR, in the study of Canadian politics, in the study of American politics, in a whole variety of disciplines, probably in sociology, probably in criminology, probably elsewhere, I just view them with such disdain, right? Because I'm one of those, I'm kind of an old purist scholar who thinks that we need to distance ourselves from the state. That's what I view as the dark side, but that's my view of the dark side. And I don't expect anybody to kind of share that view with me. You might view the dark side as being culpable with American foreign policy. Someone else might view it in a different way. And part of the problem with having this discussion is I don't really know what the dark side is.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
So a huge thanks to our panelists for coming out tonight and speaking on such an interesting topic. I hope you guys all leave with questions. And if you do have any questions, we're now going to be entering into our reception kind of phase of the evening. We have coffee, steep tea, and Timbits outside. I encourage you to come and talk to any of the panelists about what they've said tonight. As well, public announcement that on November 18th, we'll be having our second public lecture of the year. It is titled Plurien, the Environmental Policy, Responsibility, and the Way Forward. And that will be at 7:30 p.m. on Monday, November 18th, most likely in the Sterling Hall. And we will be releasing the names of the panelists very shortly for that. So please come out to that. If you have any questions for the Politicus team about either looking to get published within Politicus, which will be coming out in March, or looking to get involved with the public lecture series, please come see Woody, Michael, myself, and we'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Thanks again, everybody, for coming out. And please be sure to look at the QTV video, which will be coming out. This thing has been entirely filled, so you'll be able to look back to it. Thanks again, everybody.